Lecture 6, First Attempts at Jewish Colonization.
In the last lecture, I discussed Theodor Herzl, his biography, and his organization, the organization that he founded, the World Zionist Organization, founded in 1897. It's important to note that Herzl could not have been able to organize the World Zionist Federation organization unless there had already been support for Zionism. In other words, the World Zionist Organization was both a stimulus for and a manifestation of Zionism. The World Zionist Organization, if you remember, wanted two things. First, it wanted the sponsorship of some state for their project of colonizing Palestine. And also it wanted political guarantees from those states before such colonization would take place. Now, the World Zionist Organization, as I said, was set up as a coalition organization, but there were many Jews who felt they just could not wait. They could not wait for the sponsorship of some great power. In fact, Jewish colonization of Palestine began even before the founding of the World Zionist Organization and continued for a long time afterwards, of course. Now, in this lecture, what I want to do is to turn our attention to the earliest attempts at Jewish colonization. Before I do that, let me just lay out what the structure of the colonization or the history of colonization was all about. The history of Jewish settlement in Palestine is commonly divided into periods corresponding to waves of immigration. These waves of immigration are called aliyot, and each one is called an aliyah. It's a Hebrew term. The term itself comes from the idea of ascending. In other words, Jews from the diaspora, from the communities of Europe or North America or wherever they were coming from, would be ascending up to Palestine when they came. They would be shorn of their diaspora identity and would be, in effect, reborn in Palestine. Now, between 1882, which is the traditional date of reckoning for the first Aliyah, and 1948, which is the date of the establishment of the State of Israel, there were 7 Aliyot. Each Aliyah possessed unique characteristics. These characteristics were defined by 4 other characteristics. The first was the place of origin from which the immigrants came, Russia, Germany, North America, wherever. The second is the destination of those immigrants within Palestine, whether they would, for example, inhabit the Galilee region or the coastal plain, whether they would set up agricultural settlements or move into the cities. Thirdly, the social and economic system they supported, whether they, for example, were advocates of communal-style agricultural development or collective forms of agricultural development, or whether they themselves were, let's say, petty bourgeois capitalists, which we associate with the 4th Aliyah. And finally, the final characteristic of each Aliyah was the ideology, if any, that Aliyah possessed, the common experience, and the common mythology that was developed over time about people within that Aliyah and the experiences of that Aliyah. Now, as I said, the first Aliyah began in 1882. The year before, in the wake of the assassination of Tsar Alexander II, there broke out throughout the Russian Empire a series of anti-Jewish riots. These riots were called pogroms. Pogroms were not new to the 1880s. They had taken place periodically throughout Jewish history in Europe. They usually took place around Easter time, which corresponds, of course, to the Jewish Passover. Jews were accused of ritually killing Christian children to put in the matzahs that they ate on Passover. And the violence associated with the pogroms accelerated with the modern age. The number of those who were killed in the pogroms, however, really pale in comparison to the number of victims of the 20th century and 21st century atrocities, such as, for example, the Armenian genocide, the Holocaust, recent events in the Balkans, recent events in Rwanda, for example. Take, for example, what recently happened in Srebrenica in Bosnia, where more than 7,000 civilians were massacred in a 5-month period in 1995. Now compare that to the worst of the anti-Jewish riots that took place in Russia, the Kishinev pogrom, which took place in present-day Moldova. I'm sure identifying it with present-day Moldova does people a lot of good in terms of identifying exactly where it was. But during the Kishinev pogrom, 118 Jews were killed. I'd rather not say only 118 Jews were killed, but compare that to the 7,000 figures I said before. It's hard to imagine, therefore, what the Kishinev pogrom meant for the Jews of Europe when it did occur. We have to think back to what the 19th century meant to the Jews of Europe. It was the period of the Jewish Enlightenment. It was the period in which secularization was taking place throughout Europe. It was a period in which many Jews felt they could assimilate. And yet what happened in this great period of progress and civilization was something right out of the Middle Ages. For many Jews, the pogrom was a wake-up call. Over the next 30 years after the Kishinev pogrom, 1.5 million Jews would leave Russia. A vast majority of these Jews went to the United States. Now, interestingly, some Jews drew a slightly different conclusion from the massacre at Kishinev. A conclusion that differs from the idea that the shock of barbarism rearing its head in Europe. Take, for example, a poem by Chaim Nachman Bialik. Bialik was raised in the Jewish palace settlement and was sent to Kishinev on behalf of the Jewish Historical Commission of Odessa. He was sent there to interview survivors. After visiting the site of the massacre, Bialik wrote a scathing poem which indicts the perpetrators of the massacre. But that's not where he stops. He goes on further. He also indicts the Jews whose passivity allowed the massacre to take place. Arise and go now to the city of slaughter. Into its courtyard wind thy way. There with thine own hand touch, and with the eyes of thine head behold on tree, on stone, on fence, on mural clay, the spattered blood and dried brains of the dead. Note also, do not fail to note, in that dark corner and behind that cask, crouched husbands, bridegrooms, brothers, peering from the cracks. They saw it all. They did not stir nor move. They did not pluck their eyes out. They beat not their brains against the wall. Come now, and I will bring thee to their lairs, the privies, jakes, and pigpens, where the heirs of the Maccabees lay, with trembling knees, concealed and cowering, the sons of the Maccabees, the seed of saints, the scions of the lions, who, crammed by scores in all their sanctuaries of their shame, so sanctified my name. It was the flight of mice they fled. The scurrying of roaches was their flight. They died like dogs, and they were dead. Now, Russian Jews were not the only ones who drew conclusions from the various pogroms, nor was it Europeans alone who drew conclusions from the pogroms. The Ottoman Sultan was hardly unaware of events that were occurring in Europe, and he certainly feared large-scale Jewish immigration into the Ottoman Empire. This was not because they were Jews, this was because they were Europeans. The Ottoman Sultan issued a decree in 1882, and the decree placed a set of conditions on Jewish immigration into the Ottoman Empire. According to the decree, Jewish immigration to the empire would be possible, it would be allowed, if Jews renounced their citizenship and became Ottoman subjects. Oh, and by the way, if Jews immigrated to places other than Palestine. Thus, if Jewish immigration to Palestine did occur, it would have to occur secretly, and land purchases would have to be made through phantom agents. Fortunately for the Zionists, Ottoman inefficiency made the Sultan's decree mostly irrelevant anyway. Now, in the meantime, Jews in Russia and in Romania established committees for the purpose of assisting emigration to Palestine. For example, one of the earliest groups to organize immigration to Palestine was called the Lovers of Zion. This group was founded by 80 gymnasium students, 80 high school students in St. Petersburg. And these students were fairly split about where they would emigrate to. They were split on the issue of whether it should be the United States or to Palestine. Now, one observer of this early group of potential immigrants described them in the following way. The men wear neither sidelocks nor kaftans. They are handsome, tall, clean, intelligent. The women are almost elegant. I saw one the other day who expressed herself decently in French. The usual language of the people is Russian. By the way, that's as opposed to Yiddish. When they spoke German, they speak it with a Russian accent. Few of them employ Yiddish. Among the young people, there were many, perhaps half, who were students expelled from the gymnasium with the excuse that there was no more room. First, they were reproached for not wanting to assimilate. Now, it has been found that they are assimilating all too well. A quarter of the young men are craftsmen, sent away from their workshops by their Christian masters, or by other workmen, or by Jewish masters who were ruined in April. I have porters on my list who were chased away from the port of Odessa by Greek porters. Among the refugees are old soldiers decorated for heroism. One graybeard who came to me, who had won 3 decorations on the battlefield in his 21 years of service, had been expelled from Kiev for failing to be in the authorized category of residents. A description of the founders of the Lovers of Zion movement. In 1884, local Lovers of Zion united into a centralized organization. They elected Leo Pinsker to be their president. Now, Pinsker was fairly famous among the Jews of Europe at this time. He was an assimilated Russian Jew who had served as a doctor in the Crimean War. As a matter of fact, according to the story, he had been decorated by the Tsar for his services as a medical officer in the Crimea. The Kishinev pogrom was for Pinsker what the Dreyfus affair was to Herzl. In 1882, Pinsker wrote a pamphlet entitled Auto-Emancipation. And the pamphlet caused quite a stir among the Jews of Europe. I think you can see from the following passage of Auto-Emancipation what it was that raised so many hackles. The eternal problem presented by the Jewish question stirs men today as it did ages ago. The essence of the problem, as we see it, lies in the fact that, in the midst of nations among whom the Jews reside, they form a distinctive element which cannot be assimilated, which cannot be readily digested by any nation. Hence, the problem is to find means of so adjusting the relations of this exclusive element to the whole body of the nations that there shall never be any further basis for the Jewish question. We must prove that the misfortunes of the Jews are due, above all, to their lack of desire for national independence, and that this desire must be aroused and maintained in them if they do not wish to exist forever in a disgraceful state. In a word, we must prove that they must become a nation. The Lovers of Zion movement established an executive committee in Jaffa, Palestine, to coordinate the flow of immigrants into Palestine. Agricultural colonies were established along the coast, and then around Lake Tiberias, the Sea of Galilee, and then in the Galilee region of Palestine itself. Now, the first immigrants, as you can gather from the quote that I read earlier, the first immigrants to Palestine were fairly ill-prepared for their new life. They lacked agricultural experience. Most of them were young, idealistic students who probably had never seen a horse or a cow in an agricultural setting in their lives. They therefore came to Palestine without any preconceptions about agricultural development and borrowed many of their agricultural techniques from the indigenous inhabitants of Palestine. Techniques such as subsistence farming, what's called the field crop system, which was the planting of multiple crops to supply all the needs. Frankly, coming from New York City myself, I had to look that one up. Collective ownership of tools, of land, etc. If this sounds familiar, there's a reason for that. And the reason why it sounds familiar is this is how we describe the indigenous agricultural system in Palestine from which these people borrowed. This is just one example of the way in which colonizers and the colonized exchange ideas. It is a mutual interaction as opposed to this one-way transaction that many of us think of in terms of colonialism. Well, the British introduced Parliament into India and this, that, and the other thing, without noticing the fact that there are all sorts of not just goods, but ideas and structures and institutions that the colonized themselves impart on the colonizer. So, before I go much further, as I said in the last lecture, I really have to discuss this question of colony and colonization, colonialism and imperialism. I use colonialism and imperialism interchangeably, by the way. But let me just say, first of all, about the word colony. Colony has taken on a pejorative meaning since the period of decolonization that took place after the Second World War. Whether or not colonies and colonization is always good, always bad, sometimes good, sometimes bad, is really irrelevant. What's relevant for us today is the concept that the Jews who were going to Palestine brought with them. Colonization among those Jews in Palestine meant the expanding of the realm of European civilization into barbaric climes. Many Zionists believed and wrote that this is exactly what they were doing, that they were finding a national self-expression for themselves, and at the same time they were expanding the range of European civilization. Most Europeans at this time did not see the planting of colonies abroad as an evil. Most Europeans at this time perceived it as part of what Rudyard Kipling would later call the white man's burden. Now, let me also say something about the relationship between Zionism and imperialism, since so much has been made about it, about the relationship at international gatherings. We might define imperialism after Robinson and Gallagher, the two great theorists of imperialism, as the process whereby agents of an expanding society gain inordinate influence or control over the vitals of a weaker society by diplomacy, ideological persuasion, conquest and rule, or by planting colonies of its own peoples abroad. Now, it's easy to see how Zionism does and does not fit within this definition. On the one hand, some advocates of Zionism have argued that what this definition like this implies is a state sponsoring colonialism abroad, because the establishment of colonies abroad. France in Algeria, the British in India, so on and so forth. The Zionists were not a state operation, and so therefore this has to be seen more as immigration than as colonialism. The argument actually strikes me as being a bit specious. Now, on the other hand, the definition does imply that there is this interrelationship that takes place between the colonizer and the colonized, so that the colonizer, representing the imperialist power, is able to actually restructure in some fundamental ways the society, the economic system, and so on and so forth of the colonized. This, it might be said, did take place during the first Aliyah of Jewish immigration to Palestine. But with subsequent Aliyot, with the second and third Aliyot, where the Jewish settlers consciously attempted to sever their economic system and their entire political system from the indigenous inhabitants, such an argument is very difficult to make. Anyway, going back to the main line of the narrative, lovers of Zion, immigrants began to come to Palestine, ill-prepared for their colonization efforts, threatened by the collapse of their colonies. Representatives of the lovers of Zion appealed to the richest Jewish philanthropists in Europe. Baron Edmund de Rothschild on the one hand, and Baron Maurice de Hirsch on the other hand. From 1882 to 1900, Rothschild invested £1.5 million in Jewish colonization efforts in Palestine. Now, Rothschild was obviously not in it merely for philanthropy. He introduced what is known as the plantation system into Palestine. And this system had four characteristics by which you can see it was very, very different from the initial system that was set up. First of all, rather than subsistence crops, what Rothschild encouraged was the planting of cash crops, particularly grapes, viticulture. The second characteristic of the plantation system was that production was oriented towards the international market, not towards subsistence. Third, monoculture, the growing of one single crop, replaced field crop cultivation. And finally, since viticulture was labor-intensive, it required a large seasonal and low-priced labor source. In Palestine, Arabs provided this labor source. Plantations were mostly introduced in the plateau area of the Galilee, slightly south of the Galilee, actually. Rothschild himself chose the administrators who would be sent out to these agricultural settlements, to these plantations. Many of these administrators had experience in Algeria. They were French. The French colonized Algeria starting in 1830. And what these administrators did was they brought their experiences of Algeria to Palestine. Settlers had to obey the dictates of these administrators, and the administrators controlled the planning and the operation of the plantations. Now, unfortunately for Rothschild, Palestine did not offer a high return for the capital invested. Plantations were vulnerable to price fluctuations on the one hand, Land purchases were risky. There was no telling whether or not what you were buying is actually what you would end up getting. And development costs for plantations were high. So in 1900, Rothschild became increasingly frustrated by the progress of his plantations in Palestine, and he transferred control of these plantations to Baron de Hirsch's Jewish Colonization Association. The association attempted to eliminate much of the philanthropic nature of Rothschild's system. It withdrew subsidies to the settlements. Plantations were subdivided, and the ownership of the plantations was transferred. By 1902, many of these plantations had been dismantled, so many, in fact, that 65% of Jewish agricultural laborers had left the country because wages had dropped for them so incredibly. Now, if the first Aliyah was such a failure, perhaps a dead end, economically, politically, and so on and so forth, why is it important that we would devote so much time to it? Well, the dominant Zionist narrative looks at the first Aliyah as a precursor to the real settlement that took place during the second and third Aliyot. There are, however, reasons why the Aliyah is important, why this Aliyah is important. First, the Aliyah proved that the plantation system would not work in Palestine. It was as simple as that. It could not work. It worked in Algeria. It could not work in Palestine. The plantation system was never attempted again. This, of course, would have a dramatic effect on the way in which Palestinian agriculture, the Jewish community in Palestine, would develop. In all, in addition, 25,000 new Jews emigrated to Palestine between 1882 and 1903. Enough Jewish settlers remained in Palestine to provide the foundation and encouragement for future immigration. Without the efforts of the first Aliyah, the second and third Aliyot would have been that much more difficult. During the first Aliyah, there was an intimate connection between Jews and Arabs, an intimate economic connection between Jews and Arabs. Once local Arabs, for example, had reconciled themselves to the knowledge that the Jewish colonies would not be dislodged, they established close economic ties. Each Jewish settlement, for example, employed about 5 to 10 times as many Arabs as Jews. Overall, the Jewish colonies employed about 5,000 laborers, and only 1,200 of these were Jewish. These Jews employed were poorer immigrants, landowners whose fields had not yet become producing, and artisans who were basically out in the countryside waiting for their ship to come in on the coastal cities. In addition to that, the Arabs there was a relationship between the Zionist colonizers and the Arabs, inasmuch as the Jews bought Arab produce. Such an intimate relationship between the Jewish settlers in Palestine, and the indigenous inhabitants of Palestine would never exist again after the first Aliyah. It does, however, allow us to contemplate, perhaps a little bit wistfully, what might have been had the first Aliyah proven more economically successful. The final contribution of the first Aliyah has to do with land policy. Initially, land was purchased through private philanthropy, Rothschild, de Hirsch, etc. During the first Zionist Congress, a proposal was made to set up a Jewish National Fund. The fund came into existence in 1901. The fund supplanted previous philanthropy and ensured that there would be absolutely no private ownership of land. In other words, the fund fund purchased the land and held it in trusteeship for the entire nation.